given the highly eminent speakers who delivered this lecture before me, it is a matter of great honor for me to be here today. I have two stories to tell. One story is about the mutual relationship between reservation and the project of the annihilation of caste. The second story is about Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. But Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in two avatars. In one avatar as a visionary prophet, and in another avatar as a practical politician. My focus will be more on the first story, but I will also be talking about the second story, which requires more detailed treatment than I can give today. But we will talk about both stories simultaneously. Let me at the outset raise the questions or doubts which you must have in my mind looking at the title itself. Reservation is a concrete state policy. The annihilation of caste is an abstract utopian project. What could they have in common? The second objection is more in terms of popular common sense, which, as we all know, is shaped by the dominant classes and castes. In popular common sense today, reservation is the very antithesis of the annihilation of caste, or at least so it is claimed, that reservation is responsible for cementing caste identities and for perpetuating caste conflict. We hear this said very commonly by those who oppose reservation. If this is the common feeling, then why am I insisting on putting them together in my title? These are legitimate doubts for you to have, and I hope I will address them. I will begin to address them right away. In my opinion, and I am in very exalted company because I believe also in the opinion of Dr. Ambedkar, the two are in fact compatible. We must remember, of course, that the annihilation of caste is far more than just reservation. So there is no question of any equivalence. But there is the point that Professor Thorat also just made, that Dr. Ambedkar believed, and I think that we also, in our time, a very different time from his time, even in our time, I think we ought to believe that the two are related. Related as means and end. So reservation, even today, continues to be one of the major means by which the larger end of the annihilation of caste can be attained. Let me start with this assertion right now, and I hope in the course of my talk I will try to persuade you that this is in fact the case, using a lot of material from Dr. Ambedkar, his life, his arguments, and so on, many of which Professor Thorat has so succinctly summarized already. Let's start with the annihilation of caste, and let's start by straight off admitting that the annihilation of caste, like all utopian projects in history, remains underdetermined by facts. So it is not supported by factual description. That is perhaps not even its major social function. The major social function of utopias is to act as an inspiration. So utopias are meant to give us a sense of direction. They are not necessarily meant to provide us with a specific destination. And that is true of the annihilation of caste as well. We need to talk a lot more about this utopian project than we have so far. And that is another sort of unfinished agenda that I feel collectively we ought to take up. Let us talk about what the annihilation of caste meant, even at the level of an utopia, for Dr. Ambedkar in his own time. And to cut a long story short, I'm going to say that I'm going to bypass many links in the argument and say that for Dr. Ambedkar, if you jump to the conclusion, the annihilation of caste is essentially about one word, and that word is fraternity. For Dr. Ambedkar, the order of the French Revolution liberty, equality, fraternity is actually reversed. As he has said in many of his writings, for Dr. Ambedkar, fraternity comes first. And equality and liberty are necessary in order to bring fraternity about, but they are far from sufficient. We need liberty and equality, but what India in particular, as a caste society, needs most of all is fraternity. And it is fraternity that caste will never allow, as long as it is allowed to remain alive and working in any meaningful fashion. And hence the project of the annihilation of caste. Do remember that caste is the only sarvavyapi, all-pervasive social institution that we as a nation chose to abolish. Nobody speaks of abolishing religion. There are many kuprathaएं, many social evils associated with religion, but nobody talks about abolishing religion. We talk about reforming it, right? So if Dr. Ambedkar spoke about the annihilation of caste, a very passionate word, a very unusual word, even in his time, and a word that immediately catches your attention, there must have been a reason. And that reason is, I submit to you this, that in his view, caste society was the very antithesis of a society where fraternity was possible, even as a horizon. And therefore, not just the reform, but the annihilation of caste was necessary. And this is the utopian project. This is the abstract utopian project. So if this is the project, since, as I said, Dr. Ambedkar was not only a visionary prophet, he was also a very successful, a very able, in fact, one of our ablest practical politicians. So if we have this as our utopia, what are some of the practical ways by which we might move towards it? Even if we don't have an exact address as to annihilation of caste is to be found in this street number, this town, this place, but we know it as a general direction. What concrete measures can we take today that will help us to move in that general direction, in the general direction of this utopia? And he had essentially, again, I'm cutting a longer story short, he has a much more detailed multi-stage argument. His explanation is that fraternity can only come about through social intercourse, social interaction on the basis of equality. After all, the caste system is also about social interaction of a certain kind, right? Even capitalism is about social interaction, feudalism is about social interaction, every social system is about social interaction. But the kind of social interaction that will bring about fraternity requires a measure of equality and liberty as well. And that kind of interaction is what needs to be promoted in our society. And how will this come about? In a situation where we have a caste divided society, it will come about if we take concrete measures to ensure the inclusion, if necessary, the forcible inclusion, the state-backed forcible inclusion of those who have been excluded from our society and from the mainstream of society for centuries. And that essentially is the rationale that he has for the policy of reservation. So reservation is very far from being an end in itself for Dr. Ambedkar. It is a means to promote social interaction. And it is his belief that this kind of social interaction best begins at the top of society. So if the excluded sections are able to share in the work of governance, if they are able to share positions in the legislature, in the executive, and in the services, this will begin a chain of interactions among castes which were earlier simply not meeting. It was simply not possible for them to meet. It was illegal, in a sense. In caste law, it was illegal for them to meet. Then it will promote a certain kind of social interaction, which over time we can hope will lead to fraternity. So this is his, and as a corollary of this, how do we ensure that those, when we demand inclusion for those who have been excluded, how do we ensure that this is practical? Then we also need to demand a place in education. And that's why education is also a very important part of the bouquet or the spectrum of policies that he has in mind to firstly promote social interaction, and lastly, hopefully, to bring about fraternity. So, if this is the vision that Dr. Ambedkar had, and the place that reservation had in this larger vision, what does the story of reservation, as it has proceeded since it first started, what does it tell us? And here I will simply flag the economically weaker sections reservation as a turning point, or perhaps even it could even be a terminus. It could even be the beginning of the end of the story of the relationship between a policy like reservation and a utopia like the annihilation of caste. Let me leave it at the moment as an assertion. I will return to this at the end of my presentation. I now want to talk to you very quickly about something that Professor Thorat already summarized, Dr. Ambedkar and the prehistory of reservation. My purpose in going over this history very quickly, much of it may be familiar to some of you, is to show to you that the policy that we now recognize as reservation is a truncated, shrunken part, small, truncated, shrunken part of the broad array of policies and interventions that Dr. Ambedkar had in mind when he advocated for forms of social interaction which will end the isolation of the depressed classes. So his campaign begins formally with the Southborough Committee, as Professor Thorat has pointed out, 1919. And here he presents both written and oral evidence before this committee. And in this intervention, what he is arguing for is the series of points he's making. He starts by saying that that the untouchables are not even citizens. That citizenship involves a bundle of rights, and he lists all those rights, the usual rights that we read about in our civics books, but that untouchables are systematically excluded from every one of these rights. So the untouchable is not a citizen, he is not allowed to be a citizen. Therefore, untouchability defines a set of interests that can only be represented by the untouchables themselves, because nobody else has the experience of being of such a total exclusion. Yes, there are some rare kind persons in the upper caste who might represent the interests of the untouchables, but they will never be able to bring about, with all their good intention, they will never be able to bring about lasting change. Lasting change will only come when the untouchables are represented by themselves. So they have a claim. This claim can be met only if sufficient numbers of them are brought into positions of power, particularly in the legislature. Then there is an argument against what the Congress has been arguing, saying that there should be no special representations for anybody, special places for anybody, and that elections should be fought in joint electorates. So in other words, untouchables who wish to represent untouchables should fight elections on a level playing field with upper castes. And he points out that this can never be an equal battle, because, as he puts it, on the one hand, you're using the Shastras to educate the untouchable to be pro-touchable, and the same Shastras are educating the touchables to be anti-untouchable. So if this is what your own scriptures and your own practice in your social practice in your religion are doing, how can you ever have an equal fight, an equal contest among these two groups? And therefore, you need to have communal representation. And the final argument he gives is that communal representation, unlike what is often claimed, does not perpetuate social divisions, but paves the way towards future unity by bringing about social interaction at the level of governance itself. What I already mentioned to you, interaction in the very act of running society, when those excluded also find place in the powerful bodies, the legislature, the executive, and so on, there will be opportunities for this interaction to have, and he believes that such an interaction will have an enduring spillover beyond the narrow fields in which participation is first secured into broader society. So this is his first stage of his campaign, 1919 Southborough Committee on Franchise. The second phase, significant phase, again, Professor Thorad has mentioned it's already, is the report called States and Minorities, a very remarkable report called States and Minorities, which is presented to the Minorities Subcommittee of the Constituent Assembly. The year now has jumped to 1947. As you may be very well aware, I have skipped over some well-known portions of the intervening history. I have skipped over the roundtable conferences and Dr. Ambedkar's very influential presentations there. I have skipped over the epic fast, as it was called, which led to the Pune Pact, and I'm skipping over the Government of India Act of 1935, which resulted from the Pune Pact. These are all relatively better known aspects of the history of reservation, so I'm not spending time on this. I'll be very happy to discuss things with you if you have questions on these. So I'm jumping to the year 1947. Just ironic aside, Dr. Ambedkar cannot be elected to the Constituent Assembly in the normal course and requires the help of Jogendranath Mandal from West Bengal and the help of the Muslim League at that time in order to get elected to the Constituent Assembly. But that apart, this States and Minorities is a report that he created, he wrote, and this was presented to the Minorities Subcommittee of the Constituent Assembly. And here you can see the progression in Dr. Ambedkar's argument. His starting point and his main theme is that by now the year is 1947, so the term scheduled castes is in use. So the scheduled castes, he says, are more than a minority, because this is the time when Constituent Assembly is debating what to do about minorities. But 47 is already, in a sense, too late. Partition has happened. For some of the incidents I'm talking about, it has already happened. The events around partition cast a very long shadow, and the creation of Pakistan has a direct impact on the Constituent Assembly. Many members leave for Pakistan since a new state is formed. So in short, the tenor of discussions, the character of discussions in the Constituent Assembly before partition and after partition are very, very different. And this is the post-partition phase that I'm talking about. In this phase, what is the argument of States and Minorities? As I said, he starts by saying that they are more than a minority. In what sense are the scheduled castes more than a minority? He says that they are the only group who require all the rights that the Constitution could promise. He says they require the benefit of fundamental rights. They require the benefit of the provisions that are being provided for the minorities. This is in the pre-47 discussions. And in addition, they need special safeguards. So this is the sense in which he's saying that they are more than a minority and therefore need not just everything that is to be provided to a minority, but also further safeguards. And what are these safeguards? Note the word safeguards. Right? This is the semiotics of words is a large part of the ideology of reservation. And I will try and point out to you as we go along how changes in terminology shift the terrain of meaning, shift the innuendos, the shades of meaning associated with reservation. What are the safeguards that he's asking for? Compare the word safeguard to the word reservation in your minds, right? Where safeguard is something quite different, and it conveys something quite different. The safeguards include, again, very interesting, very important use of terms. The first set of safeguards is guarantees. The word guarantees. What is to be guaranteed? Representation at various levels of the legislature is to be guaranteed by the state. The second term is special responsibilities of the state. Again, I draw your attention to special responsibilities of the state. For what? For providing higher education. Note, higher education, not just education, higher education to the scheduled castes and land settlement. This is a point that is often forgotten, that Professor Thorat has pointed out several times. Ambedkar is asking for economic provisions as well as the special responsibility of the state. Why? Because the only group that has been systematically prevented from owning land are the scheduled castes, and therefore some special effort needs to be made by the state in order to provide them land. The third set of safeguards are sanctions. So we have guarantees, special responsibilities, and now sanctions. What are sanctions? Sanctions are essentially punishments or redressals, remedies, if the guarantees or the special responsibilities are not coming forth. If the state fails to provide the guarantees or fails to meet the special responsibilities and so on. So sanctions are essentially constitutional safeguards. And the details that he writes down there is that it should be made impossible for the state to amend the constitution so that it gets away from the guarantees and special responsibilities that he has talked about. So I could go on and tell you a few more details about this, but I shall keep going to the third stage and perhaps the most critical stage of the campaign for reservation as just one small part, but important part of a much more broad-based attempt to promote social interaction on an equal footing with the ultimate goal of the annihilation of caste. And this is the 1947, late 1947 and mostly 1948 stage of the debates in the Constituent Assembly. Many scholars have written about this phase, which is a very important phase. As I said, the tenor of discussion in the Constituent Assembly has already changed. The most important point, in my opinion, that happens here is the all-important shift from the language of, notice the language of states and minorities, safeguards, special responsibilities, language like that. The draft constitution of India, which was drawn up in 1948, early 1948, included the depressed classes in the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the minorities. And the special provisions that were to be made for all of them. But obviously, after partition, the mood of the Constituent Assembly changed and this was no longer possible. So the minorities were in disfavor, so to speak. The religious minorities were in disfavor, and the Constituent Assembly would not listen to anything about providing them anything very much. So the language shifts to a very, very crucial word, backwardness. Imagine what happens. I have written about this earlier. Part of this process starts with the Pune Pact, where what is a demand for nation sharing, what is a demand for full citizenship in the nation that is to be formed, is turned into a concession by the Pune Pact. The same thing is happening here, except that this is much, much more consequential. The language of backwardness is with us to this day, and it converts the entire issue into one of the very word backwardness suggests a deficit, some kind of a deficiency or shortcoming in the people asking for something. If you remember, what was the problem that we set out to solve with something like reservation? The problem was that of discrimination. Now, discrimination requires a discriminator. Right? You cannot have discrimination without a discriminator. The nice thing about backwardness, from the point of view of the majority in the Constituent Assembly, is that it can be treated as kudrati, natural, as a crime without a perpetrator. People are backward. That's very sad. We must do something about them. But why are they backward? As we say, they are like that only. There's no need to have an explanation, a causal explanation of where does this backwardness come from. And the language of backwardness puts the onus squarely on the victim. So you have to explain, why are you backward? And all talk of discrimination, the earlier descriptions that Dr. Ambedkar used were full of very, very graphic descriptions of the concrete content of this word discrimination that the scheduled castes suffer from. All of that is sidelined by the use of the word backward. And there is an impassioned, long discussion here, which I really recommend all of you read. Just this one date, 30th of December 1948, the discussions in the Constituent Assembly on this particular date, when the word backward is talked about a lot. The then Vice President of the Constituent Assembly starts off with the general discussion by saying that every time we go into an international forum, the existence of caste inequality is flung in our teeth. Now we have to do something about it. And therefore, let us do something about it. And the discussion that follows essentially says that where Ambedkar speaks in the end, trying to sum up the debate, and you can see the practical politician at work. The practical politician has to recognize when you take the most that you can and you don't insist on everything that you wanted. And he is saying that we have had in the drafting committee to reconcile. He starts by saying 3 different viewpoints. One viewpoint which says that there should be equality for all. Another viewpoint which says that there should be no special provisions for any group. And a third, very large group that says there should be special provision for the scheduled castes. And the only way of reconciling that is the pattern of reservation that he brings up then, where, and this is very, very important in the present context, where I'm not going to quote the exact words, but these are very famous quotations. You will have come across them already from Dr. Ambedkar, where Dr. Ambedkar is saying that the special provisions that we make must be of a minority nature, must apply to a minority of seats, because the principle of equality is equally important for our nation, for a republic. And if we allow the exceptions to expand, the exceptions will eat up the rule, he says. All our judges, when they wish to go against reservation policy, always quote this. There are so many other quotations that I'm very happy to suggest, which don't get used. But what I want to point out to you is this, that here takes shape the concrete plan for reservation as a part of the larger project of the annihilation of caste. So what happens here is the simultaneous enshrinement of the unreserved category as in its own terms, a sacred category, not to be interfered with. And at the same time, the insistence on reserved categories as equally necessary for bringing about change in a society that has resisted change very successfully for a very long time. So it is this that, on the one hand, the debit side, if you look at the debit side of the ledger, the militant language of discrimination is gone. It is not available to us, at least constitutionally, unless we insist on bringing it in some way. The word discrimination occurs in the Constitution only in the actual text of articles. It does not go much beyond that. And it occurs often, when it does occur in the text, it occurs as part of a list. Discrimination will not be on account of this, that, and the other, and lots of things. Not caste discrimination as such, which is, statistically speaking, probably the largest kind of discrimination that is going on in the country. Those who are asking for this are termed backward, deficient, lacking, needy, supplicants. They're asking for something. This naturally places the other side in the position of the owners of the nation, who are, out of their generosity, giving something to this deenheen, needy group. Look at how the scene has changed. What was being asked for was full citizenship. And what the Vice President of the Constituent Assembly was acknowledging is that we cannot, with a straight face, claim to be a modern nation if we also have caste in our midst. And therefore, we need to do something about caste. But in the manner of doing something, we have, in a sense, undermined the whole thing, made it as hollow as we could. This doesn't mean that reservation is meaningless, but this is a difficult victory, and you can look at it as glass half full, glass half empty, and this is the framework. But what I want to insist on is that this framework, the framework that Dr. Ambedkar endorsed and believed in, requires both the unreserved category, where anyone can compete on equal terms, and the reserved categories to be present simultaneously. Only then can we have this. So the history, the post-independence history, again, you are very familiar with, so I'm not going to spend very much time on this. The important dates, 1950, the January, the Constitution is adopted, and the double-sidedness of the Constitution immediately becomes obvious. By June, there is a case lodged in the Madras High Court, which demands that the communal geo, what was called the communal geo of proportion, basically the distribution of seats amongst communities in the Madras Presidency that had been going on since, officially since 2021, is violative of the new Constitution. And everyone involved in this, the lawyers, the judges, and the appellant, are all, just by coincidence, happen to be Brahmins. And the High Court immediately, imagine, January 26th, the Constitution is there, becomes law. June, the case is filed in High Court. It is decided in a matter of weeks. And the Madras government goes to the Supreme Court in appeal. Supreme Court sits on this very next year. Again, the gap is very, very, very small, and the Supreme Court also agrees that the right to equality has been violated, provided by the new Constitution, has been violated, and therefore reservation of the sort that there is there. There are some complications about this because of the Madras Presidency. I won't get into that. But essentially what happens is that the First Amendment to the Constitution has to be brought in to protect reservation in education. So 1950, 51, all of this happens. 1956, Sikh castes are included in the scheduled caste list. 1990, Neo-Buddhists are included, and as we know, 1990-91 is also the year of Mandal and all of what follows from that. The 1990s, that's a matter for another story. The 1990s are also a very important time for thinking about caste, not just about campaigns, but also about thinking about caste. In the Indian Academy as well, you could notice 1990 is a watershed, after which we have a very different kind of work that goes on caste. After the 1990s, we have a succession of demands by dominant castes from various regions, Jats, Marathas, Patidars, Kapus, who also want reservation. So the idea of reservation already in 1950, a shrunken, truncated part of the broad array of things that Dr. Ambedkar had in mind is changing shape, changing meaning even more. And the final step, of course, arrives with EWS reservation, the economically weaker sections reservation. So let me now return to my assertion that the EWS might be the beginning of the end of the story of reservation, or at least the story of reservation as a partner or as one of the means for attaining the annihilation of caste. The problem with EWS reservation has nothing directly to do with the lower caste, because it does not touch the lower caste reservation. The problem with reservation is that it undermines the unreserved category. If you undermine the unreserved category, the meaning of reservation changes completely. By providing reservation in this manner, in what I believe to, and many others believe to be an ill-considered manner, to a group which it is very hard to justify in the existing constitutional and jurisprudential framework, the door has been opened to many other such demands to be made in future. And we might be heading towards the reproduction of the communal geo of 1921 in Madras Presidency, which basically divided 100% of the seats in a political formula between the six or seven major communities. You might say that would be a step forward. If it actually comes about today, it would reduce the upper caste to something between 15 to 20% share. And you might say that that's good. But think about what we are doing in larger terms. If 100% of the cake is being distributed, there is no transcendental horizon. There is nowhere else you want to go. There is no utopia. There is no annihilation of caste. There is just buying of political peace. You have bought political peace by distributing the cake, but you have no future in mind. That, to me, should be unacceptable to every Indian. We should be able to say that we do not think of reservation as somebody cornering some benefit. We do not think of reservation as a welfare program, but we think of it, as Dr. Ambedkar thought of it, as a means to a larger goal which is in all of our interests. The annihilation of caste, though they may not believe it now, the annihilation of caste will benefit the upper castes as much, the so-called upper caste, as much as it will benefit the lower castes. Just as the change of regime, the end of apartheid in South Africa benefited whites as well, benefited them as human beings, benefited their society. Though it is difficult, it will take time for these benefits to work through. In the same way, the annihilation of caste ought to be a universal goal. And this universal goal is ruled out if we turn reservation into a political game for distributing the cake here and now without any tomorrow. There is no tomorrow in our minds. There is nothing larger that we want to work towards. That cannot be. I would submit to you, though this was never said explicitly, or at least I'm not aware that this was said explicitly, the function of the reserved categories or reservation itself is to change over time the social composition of the unreserved category. That is the job that reservation is supposed to do. So, reservation in generation 1 will, in generation 4 or generation 5, alter the composition of the unreserved category. And once the unreserved category begins to resemble society at large, reservation has done its job. We don't need reservation anymore after that, because it would mean that we are on the way to, if not the annihilation of caste, at least we are, in the right, we are moving in the right direction. But that is not how reservation is thought about today, sadly. And that is what needs to be insisted upon. In fact, it took court cases and it required the Supreme Court to intervene before it was agreed that the unreserved category was not effectively reserved for the upper castes, and that those who qualified for it, even if they belonged to castes which were eligible for reservation, must be allowed in. That is the whole function of the unreserved category, as to act as a test of the performance of, if you want, in social audit language, we speak of the performance of programs, of policies. So the performance of reservation can be measured by the social composition of the unreserved category. If you don't have an unreserved category, you're not interested in any future. You're not interested in transcending caste. You're only interested in, to use a word that has become very popular, revdi badna. You're interested in ensuring that my share of revdi is, proper, and you're not getting more revdi than I'm getting, and so on. This is a sectarian issue. There is nothing progressive, there is nothing uplifting about it. And I would like to stop here by insisting once more that the most successful blow, or the most successful way of crippling the imagination of oppressed peoples, excluded peoples, is to make them believe that they cannot, should not, ought not to try for the universal. To try, in our everyday terms, to try for the unreserved category. I believe that we should not do that, and we should insist that the function of reservation is precisely to enable those who are unable to compete in the unreserved category today, tomorrow, day after. The success story for us is Tamil Nadu. There are many things wrong with Tamil Nadu, but this is not one of them. It took a century. I was hoping that I would have statistics to share with you, but my friends in Tamil Nadu tell me that those studies are still going on. This is a matter of great interest in Tamil Nadu itself. So the government and everybody is looking into this, and very shortly we hope to have statistics that will show, anecdotal evidence is already there that this is happening in Tamil Nadu, that the composition of the unreserved category today is very close to the composition of society at large. So Tamil Nadu may have shown us the way, but it takes a century. Remember, the communal geo came in 1921. So it takes 4-5 generations. We have to be ready to wait for that. But that is the horizon we should insist on. We should insist on a larger horizon beyond reservation.